President taking some more questions there because he didn't take a whole lot at the actual press conference itself. Let's bring in Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman. He's the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. He's also the co-chair of the Ukraine caucus. Chemical weapons is a big concern of yours because there are assessments that Vladimir Putin, backed into a corner if he sees this as a stalemate and nothing's moving, may resort to chemical weapons to try to shake something loose. President Biden at his brief NATO press conference was asked about it. Listen to what he said.
I can't answer that. I'm not going to give you intelligence data, number one. Number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
He later went on to say that it would trigger a response in kind. I'm not sure those are the words that he meant to say, because that would suggest that we would respond with chemical weapons as well. But to the bigger point, you believe that President Biden should draw a red line with Russia in terms of the potential use of chemical weapons. Yet in September of 2013, the Obama administration, of which Biden was a part, drew a red line in the sand in Syria and then ignored it. So why would Russia be afraid of a red line?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think one of the lessons we've learned in this Russian invasion of Ukraine is that we did not make it clear up front what would happen. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, based on intelligence that's now publicly available, miscalculated. He thought, well, the West is really not going to respond, even with tough sanctions. He also miscalculated as to the Ukrainian response and the degree of bravery and courage we'd see. But I think we've got to be clear, John. I think that's one of the lessons we've learned. And let's be clear to try to have it be a deterrent from him going to these kind of horrible weapons, and whether it's chemical weapons or biological weapons or, God forbid, a strategic military strike, we've got to be very clear up front that these will have serious consequences.
In terms of serious consequences, what should the response be?
Well, I'm not suggesting it should be in kind, which apparently the president said, but I think, we have to step it up militarily. A no-fly zone is difficult because of the fact that you have these Soviet-era systems in Ukraine that are not effective always as against the more modern Russian systems that are in Ukraine, that are in Russia and Belarus. You'd probably have to take those out. But that's one idea.
Yeah.
Senator, thanks so much for joining us. The Fox News polling does show that when asked, should the U.S. be doing more to help the Ukrainians in this fight against Russia, 63% say yes. I know that you fall into that category. You've laid forward a series of ways to do so, including weapons, sanctions, tax treatment. We should not let Russia be part of our normal trade market process. But you also go into fully sanctioning Russia's energy sector. And I think a lot of people are still surprised to learn that we have not fully done so. Can you be more specific on how you want to target the energy sector, knowing that that can and would inflict a lot of pain on Europe, that many countries still are very, very dependent on that Russia energy source?
Well, Senator, the bottom line is the number one revenue source for Russia is energy. So it's their biggest export. It's where they're getting most of the revenue to fund the war machine. So we've got to do more to cut that off. There are some countries that are very dependent on Russian gas, in particular in Europe, where that's more difficult. But look, we did it here. We cut off not just oil and gas, but also coal exports. And we need to have other countries do the same. In order to help some of these European countries deal with this transition away from the Russian fuel, we should be providing them more of our own fuel, because we've got plenty of it, as do other countries that are willing to help, particularly in the Mideast, and that would be liquefied natural gas going into these countries. So I think we should immediately enter into contracts for liquefied natural gas, let the Europeans, like Germany, know that we're going to be there to help them. Other countries like Qatar are willing to do the same thing. That's going to be the most important sanction left, which is to cut off this revenue that he's getting to fund the war machine. By the way, we also, in our country, have sanctions on banks that we've put out, but some of these sanctions don't go into effect as they relate to energy transactions until June 24th. That's way too late. So we've got to also tighten up what we're doing with regard to the financial sanctions as they relate to energy.
Yeah, Senator, I want to revisit something that General Jack Keane said on America's Newsroom earlier today. There's talk about the chemical weapons threat, but then there's also talk about potential of a nuclear threat as well. Dmitry Peskov, the Pentagon, I said that again, the Kremlin spokesperson, said that it's not off the table, that if Russia feels that there's an existential threat, they might pull that trigger. Jack Keane this morning said, look, we got to stop worrying so much about this. Listen to what he said.
Why do we keep wringing our hands almost daily about Russians' possible use of WMD, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, and cyber attacks? let's stop talking about that. What we should be doing is making unequivocal, strong statements, United States and NATO, when it comes to WMD, Harris. It is unacceptable. We will not let it stand, and we will take decisive action against you.
So General Keane is suggesting, Senator, that the response should have been much stronger than what President Biden articulated earlier.
Yeah, look, I tend to agree. As I said earlier, you need to draw that red line, because we have learned that if you don't, then Russia will cross into these sort of forbidden areas, in this case WMD, biological, chemical, nuclear. So I think it's better to be frank up front, but we've got to think through this with our allies, make sure that they are on board. If they're not on board, then we need to understand that up front. And I think there ought to be serious consequences. We ought to let them know now.
Mm-hmm.
Senator, I want to finish off with this Wall Street Journal headline: Ukraine can win with enough help. It says President Biden's rightly outraged by Putin's brutality, and he calls him a war criminal, but he still seems afraid of doing what it takes to defeat him. Do you think the president, now that he's on the ground there and he sort of just gave away that he's going to be visiting the Ukrainian border, do you think anything he sees, anyone he speaks with or meets with, we know he's in a closed-door meeting right now, will change his approach to all of this?
Well, it can't help but affect you. I was down on that border with Poland and Ukraine only 2 weeks ago, and oh my gosh, it's just heartbreaking talking to the refugees coming across and hearing their stories of homes being destroyed, family members being killed, all the men being left behind to fight. I mean, it is tearing apart a country, obviously, and a people. So I think he'll be affected by it. And look, I think that Wall Street Journal editorial was right on. We've got to lead. We've got to talk about winning, not about how we lose more slowly. So this means we've got to step up the military assistance. We've got to tighten up the sanctions, particularly as they relate to energy, because that's where so much of the revenue is coming from. And, we've got to let the Ukrainian people and the world, both our allies and our adversaries, know, where we stand. We stand not with tyranny. We stand with freedom.
Senator Rob Portman, that was great to see you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks,
John.
Senator.
Appreciate it.